Before we start, don't forget to hit that like button. Our goal is to reach 500 likes on this video, and with your support, we can make it happen. Now, let's dive straight into the entire story of the Portuguese Empire, the dawn of Portugal. From small kingdom to big ambitions. Picture this, a tiny kingdom tucked against the edge of Europe, its back pressed to Spain, and its face turned toward the endless ocean. At first glance, Portugal in the 12th and 13th centuries looked destined to remain quiet, unremarkable, overshadowed by bigger neighbours. Yet, somehow, this little strip of land would one day command an empire stretching across 3 oceans. How did that happen? That's the puzzle I want to unravel with you. Let's rewind. Portugal wasn't even Portugal yet. It was part of a messy frontier between Christian kingdoms and the Muslim-controlled Al-Andalus. Think of it like a chessboard where every square could change hands overnight. Out of this chaos rose Afonso Henriques, a man with both stubbornness and vision. He declared independence from Leon in the 12th century, fought off rivals, and carved out a kingdom by sheer force of will. Imagine being surrounded by powers much larger than New Spain to the east, powerful Moorish states to the south, and still daring to plant your own flag. That boldness was baked into Portugal from the start. But survival alone wasn't enough. The land was small, resources limited, and bigger kingdoms always seemed ready to swallow it up. So what do you do when your house is too cramped? You look outward. The sea became Portugal's escape, its opportunity, its obsession. The Atlantic was less a road and more a vast, terrifying mystery. Few dared to test it. Yet for Portugal, that horizon was both shield and promise. It protected them from invasion but whispered possibilities, new lands, wealth, chances to matter where small kingdoms usually didn't. This mindset didn't come overnight. Generations of kings balanced survival at home with cautious steps outward. They fought along the Iberian Peninsula, slowly pushing the Moors south until capturing Algarve in the 13th century. That victory gave Portugal full control of its coastline, a doorway to the ocean, with harbours ready to launch dreams. Here's where things change. Other European kingdoms tangled in wars over land and power. Portugal began to imagine power beyond borders. People developed seafaring skills, building ships for the rough Atlantic. Fishermen sailed farther. Traders tested new routes, and courage grew. You can feel that restlessness, the sense that the kingdom's destiny wasn't confined to Iberia. Faith played a role too. The Reconquista, centuries-long battles against Muslim states, wasn't just about land, it was identity. Victories were celebrated as divine favor. Defending Christianity became part of the story, and later, sailors carried that belief into the unknown. A mindset born in Iberian battlefields fueled voyages across oceans. Even before Prince Henry the Navigator, whose story we'll dive into later, the seeds of expansion were there. Portugal was never content to remain a buffer state between Spain and the sea. Every step of early growth pointed outward toward a destiny beyond Europe. Smallness made them hungry. Vulnerability made them daring. Geography gave them a stage. Inland kingdoms could not claim. By the 14th century, Portugal stood more secure than ever. Borders were recognized, independence solidified, ports buzzed with activity. Yet beneath that stability burned impatience. Why settle for just surviving? Why not become greater? Those questions quietly guided choices. When the age of exploration finally cracked open, It wasn't an accident Portugal was first through the door. The dawn of Portugal wasn't just about castles, battles, or treaties. It was about a tiny nation learning to think big. From the start, it carried a paradox: too small to dominate neighbours, yet too restless to remain in their shadow. That paradox became Portugal's greatest strength. And soon, as we'll see with Prince Henry the Navigator, that restless strength would turn into something the world had never seen: a small kingdom shaping the map of the entire world. Prince Henry the Navigator and the birth of exploration. Imagine standing on the edge of Europe in the early 12th century, looking out at an ocean so vast it swallowed dreams and ships. Portugal wasn't always a global empire. It was once a small kingdom tucked between Spain and the Atlantic, trying to find its place in a world dominated by larger powers. Its beginnings were humble, marked by struggles for survival and identity, yet those struggles planted the seeds of something greater. In those early days, Portugal was like a fragile sapling in rocky soil. Count Afonso Henriques, later King Afonso I, had a vision: to carve a kingdom out of contested lands, a place that could stand independently. He fought battles against Moors and neighbouring Christian kingdoms, navigating shifting alliances and constant threats. Each victory wasn't just about land. It was proof that this tiny kingdom could endure against all odds. But survival wasn't enough. Portugal's leaders realized that staying small on land meant looking outward. The Atlantic, once feared as a barrier, became an invitation. Coastal cities like Porto, Lisbon, and Coimbra transformed into hubs of trade and seafaring. Fishermen, who once feared the deep, began charting their own courses, learning tides and winds. These early encounters laid the groundwork for a culture that would eventually embrace exploration as identity. Portugal's geographic position was a silent advantage. At the crossroads of Europe and Africa, with easy Atlantic and Mediterranean access, ideas, goods, and technologies flowed through its ports faster than in neighbouring lands. Knowledge of navigation, shipbuilding, and trade grew steadily, setting the stage for expansion under Prince Henry the Navigator. The kingdom's rulers were pragmatic but ambitious. Military conquest alone couldn't make Portugal a power. They fostered trade along Africa's coast, created alliances, and learned about distant cultures. Early voyages weren't grand explorations, but experiments, trips to gather knowledge, test ships, and map coastlines. These steps built confidence, knowledge, and networks, the invisible infrastructure of a future empire. Religion played a role too. Portugal saw itself as a defender of Christianity, pushing back Muslim powers and spreading faith. Churches and monasteries became centers of education and record-keeping. Monks kept maps, chronicled journeys, and studied stars, feeding curiosity about the wider world. Faith, survival instinct, and ambition became hallmarks of Portugal's rise. By the late 14th century, Portugal had stabilized enough to look beyond threats. Coastal fortifications protected trade, and navigational knowledge grew. Its small size forced innovation rather than dominance, creating creativity, daring, and adaptability. These traits defined explorers from Bartolomeu Dias rounding the Cape of Storms to Vasco da Gama reaching India. The empire's global reach had roots in these small, cautious steps. Growth wasn't linear. Rivalries, disputes, and economic challenges tested the kingdom. Each challenge forced innovation, new ships, instruments, and strategies. By the 15th century, Prince Henry inherited ports, knowledge, and maritime culture ready to leap into the unknown. Portugal's dawn is a story of vision from necessity, a small kingdom that refused limits, looked at the ocean, and saw possibility instead of danger. Survival evolved into curiosity, then strategy. The Atlantic, once a boundary, became a bridge. Portugal's early leaders quietly built the foundation for explorers, merchants, and missionaries who would create a global empire, sailing beyond fear. The breakthroughs of early voyages. Imagine standing at the edge of the known world, staring at the horizon where the ocean seems to fall into nothingness. People whispered that sea monsters waited just beyond sight, that the waters boiled, that no man could sail too far without vanishing forever. And yet there were men who stepped onto fragile wooden ships and pushed forward anyway. That clash between fear and the hunger for discovery was when Portugal began to turn from a small kingdom into a name the whole world would soon know. It's almost strange to think how much courage this took. Today, we hop on planes without a thought. But back then, the sea was alive with mystery. No maps, no engines, no satellites. Just the wind, the stars, and a determination strong enough to drown out fear. And the Portuguese weren't just chasing adventure, they were chasing survival. Their kingdom sat on Europe's edge, boxed in by bigger powers, with land too poor to make them rich. The ocean became their gamble, their chance to stand out. Prince Henry the Navigator was the spark. He built schools, gathered the best minds, and sent ships down the African coast. At first, voyages were timid. Sailors clung to the shoreline, edging a little farther each year. The Canary Islands, Madeira, the Azores stepping stones into the Atlantic, every mile gained was a triumph against centuries of fear. Cape Bojador was the real test. Rumour said no one could pass and live. For years, ships turned back. Then, in the year 1434, Gil Eanes, a Portuguese captain, pushed through. What did he find? Calm seas. No monsters, no boiling oceans, just fear, shattered. That moment was more psychological than geographical. The ocean was no longer a prison, it was a pathway. This became the rhythm of the early voyages. Hesitation, then a leap that changed everything. Once one sailor proved it possible, others followed. Soon Portuguese ships brought back tales of gold dust, exotic animals, and strange new peoples. The crown saw profit, merchants smelled trade, and the church saw souls waiting to be converted. The seed of gold, idols, and glory was planted. But don't mistake these men for fearless adventurers. They were terrified. Storms shredded sails, disease spread fast, food ran out. Death was always a stowaway. Yet the promise of wealth, and for some, salvation kept them going. Desperation mixed with vision made the impossible possible. What fascinates me is how quickly the unthinkable became normal. Within a generation, men who once feared leaving sight of land were sailing thousands of miles into waters no European had ever charted. That shift in mindset mattered as much as the discoveries themselves. It was the same leap of thought that later carried Bartolomeu Dias around the Cape of Storms and Vasco da Gama to India. For now, picture a small wooden caravel, triangular sails catching the wind, gliding farther down Africa's coast than any ship before it. The crew whispers nervously about monsters, and then nothing happens. No beasts, no fire on the waves. The sun sets, the stars come out, and they realize something huge. The world is bigger than they imagined, and it's waiting for them. This was the dawn of a new era, a time when Portugal's courage outweighed its size, when fear became just a shadow to sail through. These voyages didn't just redraw maps, they redrew human imagination. And once that imagination was unleashed, there was no turning back. Because after all, if you can conquer your deepest fears, what horizon could possibly stop you? Bartolomeu Dias and the rounding of the Cape of Storms. Imagine standing on the deck of a ship, the horizon stretching endlessly, and knowing the land you seek lies thousands of miles away, past storms and fears you can't even name. This was Vasco da Gama, chosen by the King of Portugal in the year 1497 to attempt what no European had done, sail directly to India. The world felt bigger than ever, and da Gama was about to shrink it with courage, luck, and sheer determination. Portugal had been chasing this dream for decades. Prince Henry the Navigator had laid the foundation. Bartolomeu Dias had already rounded the Cape of Storms, proving the Atlantic met the Indian Ocean. But the prize remained, the spice trade. Riches, prestige, and the spread of faith all collided in this mission. The fleet left Lisbon in July 1497, 4 ships cutting through the waves. The first leg down the West African coast was familiar but dangerous. Da Gama's crew battled storms, disease, and mutiny. The further south they sailed, the more the known world fell away. Hunger gnawed. Fear spread. At the Cape of Good Hope, Dias's dreaded landmark, violent storms nearly ended them. Some nights, da Gama must have wondered if the sea would ever let them go. Past the Cape, they entered the Indian Ocean, where winds and currents ruled. Navigation became instinct and faith in the stars. Sailors whispered of monsters and curses, but da Gama pressed on. They reached the East African coast Mozambique, Malindi, where they repaired, traded, and gained vital guidance from local pilots. Then came the long push across open waters until the glittering coastline of Calicut finally appeared. India at last. Arrival brought wonder and tension. Merchants eyed the strangers with suspicion. Negotiations were fraught, but da Gama secured spices and proved the sea route real. For Europe, this changed everything. The Portuguese had bypassed the old overland trade routes, undercutting Arab and Ottoman control, and opened a direct highway to the riches of the East. The return was just as brutal: storms, shortages, and fear. But when da Gama sailed back into Lisbon, crowds cheered. The impossible had been achieved. Portugal now held the key to global trade, a path that would dominate for decades. Though da Gama would make later voyages, facing battles, politics, and disease, this first journey was the crown jewel. Dias rounding the Cape of Storms had been the stepping stone. Da Gama's triumph was the leap. From Goa to later colonies, all traced back to this voyage. It marked the beginning of Portugal's global dominance, when oceans became highways for empires and the world seemed to shrink. Vasco da Gama's expedition wasn't just navigation, it was vision realized. He faced storms, hunger, and doubt, but sailed anyway, leaving behind a path others would follow for centuries. From the Cape of Storms to the ports of India, da Gama's voyage stands as a testament to human ambition and the dawn of a global age. Vasco da Gama's epic journey to India. Picture this: wooden ships straining against unpredictable winds, crews half-starved yet pushing into waters no European had ever crossed. At the center stood Vasco da Gama, chosen by Portugal in the year 1497 to attempt the impossible, sailed directly to India. Failure meant not only death, but vanishing into the sea without a trace. By then, Portugal was a small kingdom surrounded by bigger powers like Spain and the Ottomans. Thanks to Prince Henry the Navigator and explorers like Bartolomeu Dias, who had rounded the Cape of Storms, Portugal was already bold. But one dream remained: reaching India by sea. Not through middlemen, not across deserts, but straight from Lisbon to the land of spices and unimaginable wealth. This wasn't just about riches. Spices like pepper and cinnamon were worth more than gold. It was about survival, breaking the monopoly Arab and Venetian merchants held. And so, Vasco da Gama, son of a knight but still unknown, was entrusted with the mission. The voyage began in July 1497. 4 ships set out with sailors, soldiers, and interpreters. They hugged Africa's coast at first, but da Gama pressed further. Seas were wild, men weakened from scurvy, some begged to turn back, but he drove them on. Here's the detail most forget. Success hinged on navigation and timing. Along East Africa's coast, da Gama clashed with Arab merchants in Mozambique and Mombasa. But in Malindi he found crucial help, an Indian navigator who guided them across the Indian Ocean using the monsoon winds. Without him, da Gama might never have reached India. In May 1498, after nearly a year at sea, they reached Calicut. Imagine Portuguese sailors stepping into a world of colour, spices, and temples, but locals weren't impressed. Tied to Arab traders, they mocked da Gama's gifts, common European goods with little value. Still, he had done what no European had, found the sea route to India. The return was brutal. Storms battered ships, disease claimed lives, and many never saw Portugal again. But when the survivors limped back to Lisbon in September 1499, the city erupted in celebration. That single voyage changed everything. Portugal now held the key to the spice trade. Soon fortresses would rise in Goa and Malacca. But it all began here. A gamble turned turning point. Da Gama would return, with far more violence later, but this first journey revealed the audacity of a small kingdom daring to challenge the world. Remember Bartolomeu Dias rounding the Cape? That was the door creaking open. Vasco da Gama's voyage was the step through it, into a world that would shape centuries of trade, conflict, and empire. And those spices weren't just wealth. They carried seeds of both glory and destruction, rippling across continents. The spice trade. Gold, idols, and glory collide. Imagine standing on a bustling dock in Lisbon in the early 1600s. The air thick with salt, tar, and something far more intoxicating: cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. Ships from India, Malacca, and the Moluccas unload treasures once worth more than gold. This was not just trade. It was obsession, gamble, and war across oceans for spices that could turn a meal into magic. Long before these docks overflowed, the spice trade was a dream whispered in royal courts. Vasco da Gama's path to India wasn't just a route, it was a highway to riches. Europeans had craved these flavors for centuries. Pepper made stews luxurious, cinnamon preserved food, and cloves disguised rot in a world without refrigeration. Every pinch carried power. Portugal's advantage was clear. They controlled the sea routes. Venice and Genoa had relied on costly caravans across the Middle East, controlled by Muslim empires. Portugal cut out the middlemen. They built forts along Africa, mastered navigation, and used alliances or force. Each fortress was a customs office for spice and a statement that Portugal ruled the waves. But it wasn't only money. Religion mattered. Portuguese explorers saw themselves as carrying Christianity with their trade. Missionaries sailed with merchants, establishing churches in Goa, Malacca, and Macao. Spices and faith fed each other. Merchants needed safe harbors, missionaries smoothed resistance, and both claimed victory. Glory was the third pillar. Portugal was small in Europe, but mighty at sea. Every voyage amplified their reputation. Vasco da Gama's return was more than a financial win, it proved. Portugal could bend the globe to its ambition. The world became a stage, with Portugal in a starring role. Competition was fierce. Ottomans, Arabs, and later the Dutch all wanted a share. Battles raged on land and sea, fortunes rising and falling with each storm or ambush. Portugal learned to blend diplomacy with cannon fire, protecting trade with both charm and force. Each victory reinforced the belief that the sea was where empires were truly built. Spices transformed Europe. Demand reshaped markets, drove shipping innovations, and changed social hierarchies. Merchants gained power, kings wealth, and ordinary people tasted flavors once reserved for royalty. Lisbon became a city alive with rhythms of distant lands, where gold, idols, and glory fused into one intoxicating force. This obsession paved the way for Portugal's later ventures in Brazil, Macao, and Africa. The networks and audacity built here rippled outward, shaping every voyage, colony, and clash. It proved a small kingdom could leave a global mark if it dared to sail further, fight harder, and dream bigger. In the end, the spice trade wasn't just commerce, it was the heartbeat of an empire. Gold bought loyalty, faith justified conquest, and glory turned a kingdom into legend. Portugal's obsession with these tiny treasures changed history, proving that ambition, mixed with courage and cunning, could turn even the smallest nation into a world power. Establishing fortresses. How Portugal controlled the seas. Picture a string of islands, rocky outcrops, and distant coastlines stretching across the globe. Each one was a potential battlefield, a trading post, or a haven for pirates, and Portugal wanted control over them all. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Portugal wasn't just sending ships out to explore. It was building an empire on water, anchored by fortresses that turned the vast, unpredictable oceans into controlled highways of trade and power. It all started with necessity. Explorers like Bartolomeu Dias and Vasco da Gama had pushed the limits of the known world, opening routes to Africa, India, and eventually the Spice Islands. But discoveries alone didn't secure wealth. Ships laden with precious spices, gold, and other goods were vulnerable. Pirates, rival nations, and hostile locals could strike at any moment. Portugal realized that to dominate the seas, it needed permanent outposts, fortresses that could protect ships, store supplies, and assert authority over strategic points. These fortresses were more than walls and cannons. They were the hubs of an empire, blending military, economic, and cultural functions. Take Elmina on the Gold Coast. Built to secure gold and ivory, it wasn't just a defensive post. It was where Portuguese traders negotiated with rulers, collected taxes, and organized voyages. Every fortress was a node in a vast network, keeping trade flowing and under Portuguese control. The design was both practical and symbolic. Thick stone walls, towers, and positions on cliffs or river mouths made them formidable. They could repel attacks from land or sea and dominate surrounding territory. Inside, they bustled with merchants, soldiers, priests, and sometimes families. Portugal wasn't content just to sail the seas, it wanted to settle them, turning ocean routes into extensions of the kingdom. A single fortress could project power far beyond Portugal's small population. From Hormuz in the Persian Gulf to Malacca on the Malay Peninsula, strongholds controlled harbours, enforced monopolies, and deterred rivals like the Ottomans, Arabs, and later the Dutch. They didn't just protect ships, they controlled the flow of goods, ensuring spices, silks, and other treasures passed through Portuguese hands. The empire became a chain of fortified choke points stretching from Africa to Southeast Asia. Fortresses also kept sailors alive. Months at sea left crews desperate for water, food, and repairs. These posts acted as resupply stations, reducing the risk of scurvy and shipwrecks. Captains learned that navigation alone wasn't enough endurance, and planning mattered. Knowing a fortress awaited was like having a small home in foreign waters. Faith travelled with the forts. Missionaries accompanied the garrisons, spreading Christianity and founding schools and chapels. In Goa, for example, the fortress grew into a city and cultural hub, the Jewel of the East. These were not isolated military sites. They became living centres of empire, blending local societies into Portugal's global web. Rivalries tested these fortresses constantly. The Dutch, the British, and local powers challenged Portuguese dominance, often launching attacks or trying to bypass them. But Portugal's strategy of strategic placement and fortified strength kept its network resilient for decades. Each fortress acted as a domino in a larger system, and even if one fell, others could hold the line, protecting trade and influence across thousands of miles of ocean. By the time the empire reached its height, the combination of navigational skill, daring explorers, and fortified outposts had turned Portugal into a true maritime superpower. Its forts weren't just stone and mortar. They were symbols of strategy, vision, and the understanding that controlling the seas required more than ships. It required permanence, presence, and planning. Looking back, it's clear that these fortresses were the backbone of Portugal's empire. They made the vast oceans navigable, trade predictable, and power enforceable. Without them, voyages to India, Southeast Asia, and Brazil might have been fleeting adventures rather than the foundation of a global network. Portugal learned that domination of the seas wasn't about individual heroics alone. It was about building a network of strongholds that could turn ambition into lasting control. And so, stone by stone and harbour by harbour, Portugal carved its empire across the oceans, proving that in the age of exploration, a fortress wasn't just a building, it was the key to the world. Goa and the Jewel of the East. If you've ever imagined a city where every street smells of spices, every sunset paints the sky like a painting, and every stone whispers stories of distant lands, that place is Goa. But centuries ago, it wasn't the paradise we picture today. It was a prize, a battleground, a tiny strip of land that would become the crown jewel of Portugal's empire in the east. And the journey to get there wasn't easy. It was stitched together with ambition, daring, and a touch of obsession. Picture the year 1501. Portuguese ships were already threading their way around Africa, opening new paths and shattering the fear of the unknown. Vasco da Gama's journey to India had proved the ocean could be a highway to riches. But reaching Goa, a small but strategically perfect coastal town in India, was about more than gold. It was about controlling the flow of trade, particularly the spices that Europe craved. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, just the thought made kings and merchants restless. And Portugal, small but fiercely determined, wanted in on it before anyone else. Afonso de Albuquerque, the man tasked with the conquest, wasn't your typical soldier. He had vision. Where others saw villages, he saw fortresses. Where others saw sand and palm trees, he saw a gateway to dominance over the Indian Ocean. His plan was simple yet audacious. Seize key ports, build strongholds, and make sure that no rival could challenge Portuguese control. Goa became the crown jewel, not by chance, but by strategy, determination, and a willingness to push beyond fear, much like the early explorers we talked about before. The capture of Goa in 1517 wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point. Albuquerque's forces, smaller in number but precise and ruthless, took the city almost like a chess move, cutting off resistance and securing a base that would anchor Portugal's influence in the east for centuries. Once they were in, the Portuguese didn't just build forts, they built a vision. Churches rose alongside marketplaces, blending European architecture with Indian traditions. Streets hummed with merchants from across Asia, and the scent of spices mingled with the salt from the sea. But Goa wasn't just a commercial prize. It became a cultural experiment, a bridge between worlds. Missionaries followed the soldiers, spreading Catholic faith, translating texts, and sometimes clashing with local beliefs. The city became a laboratory for Portuguese influence. Language, law, and religion layered over centuries of Indian tradition. It was messy, complex, and fascinating. The mix of local and European culture gave Goa a character no one could replicate, a legacy that survives even today. What made Goa extraordinary wasn't just what Portugal brought, it was what it became over time. Fortresses like Aguada and Reis Magos turned the coastline into an almost impenetrable line of defense. Markets thrived on trade that stretched from Japan to Africa, connecting the Portuguese Empire across oceans. Ships docked carrying silk, silver, spices, and stories, each voyage adding another layer to Goa's importance. It wasn't just a city, it was a hub that made the empire feel tangible, alive, and unstoppable. Of course, this jewel wasn't free from threats. Rival empires watched closely. Arabs, the Ottoman Turks, and later the Dutch, all eyed Goa, eager to snatch a slice of its wealth. The Portuguese had to constantly adapt, reinforcing fortifications, building alliances, and sometimes fighting brutal battles to maintain control. That tension, the constant push and pull, gave Goa its edge, a place that could survive attacks and still flourish, a testament to Portuguese resilience. Walking through Goa today, it's hard to imagine the risks that shaped it. Stone streets, vibrant markets, and centuries-old churches stand as witnesses to ambition and strategy that once stretched across continents. Each spice-scented breeze carries echoes of ships, of explorers, of a small European nation daring to dominate the waves. Goa was more than a city. It was a symbol of what Portugal could achieve when vision met courage, when fear was left behind and ambition took the helm. From here, the empire extended into Macao, Brazil, and beyond. And though we'll see later how the empire slowly unraveled, in its golden age. Goa truly shone as the jewel of the East, a reminder of what can happen when dreams are mapped onto the world's vast oceans. It wasn't just about conquering land, it was about controlling imagination, trade, and the flow of history itself. The streets of Goa tell that story even now, whispering of an era when a tiny kingdom changed the world, one voyage, one fort, and one city at a time. The rise of Macao, Europe's gateway to China. Close your eyes and picture a tiny rocky peninsula on the edge of a vast river delta, where the air smells of salt, incense, and spices carried from distant lands. This is Macao, a place that would become Europe's first real window into China. A city where two worlds collided in ways both magical and tense. It didn't start as a bustling trading hub. In the early 1500s, it was just a cluster of fishing villages, overlooked by the towering mountains and mysterious rivers of southern China. But something remarkable was about to change all that. Portugal, flush with success after opening the sea route to India, had ambitions that stretched even further. They wanted China, not just its goods, but a foothold in the richest, most sophisticated empire on earth. The Portuguese had already tested the waters in places like Malacca and Goa, establishing forts and trading posts, but China was a different challenge entirely. The Ming dynasty was powerful, cautious, and proud. No European had ever really settled there. And yet, by the year 1557, a small contingent of Portuguese merchants and officials arrived in Macao, negotiating their place on this strategic strip of land. The locals weren't immediately welcoming. The Ming authorities were wary of foreigners, especially those who brought guns, strange customs, and the ambitious idea of trade on their terms. Early interactions were tense, marked by suspicion and negotiation. But the Portuguese had a kind of stubborn charm. They offered protection against pirates, knowledge of foreign navigation, and access to goods from distant lands. Slowly, they carved out a small enclave in Macao, an arrangement that was precarious but mutually beneficial. By the late 1500s, Macao had transformed. Narrow cobblestone streets were lined with whitewashed houses, churches, and warehouses, all crowded with crates of silk, porcelain, and spices. The smell of exotic goods mixed with the local cuisine, creating a sensory mosaic that no European city could rival. Traders, missionaries, and sailors from all over Europe passed through, making Macao the beating heart of East-West commerce. Jesuit missionaries, in particular, saw Macao as their gateway to spreading the Catholic faith deeper into China, learning the language and customs before venturing further inland. Their efforts would connect to the broader theme of European influence in Asia, much like the missions in India or Brazil. The city's rise wasn't just about trade. It was a story of adaptation and tension. Portuguese administrators had to respect local laws while maintaining their privileges, balancing diplomacy with subtle displays of power. They paid rent to local authorities, built fortifications, and kept a fleet nearby, ready to defend their position. Macao became a hub of cultural exchange. European ideas, maps, and technology flowed in one direction, while Chinese art, philosophy, and goods flowed the other way. This delicate dance created a hybrid identity, unique to Macao, where two worlds met without fully merging. Over time, Macao's strategic importance grew. European traders used it as a base to reach the lucrative markets of Japan and Southeast Asia, and its port became essential for the flow of silver from the Americas, which fueled the Chinese economy. The city became a microcosm of Portugal's global ambitions. Small in size, but immense in influence, It illustrated how the empire could connect continents, linking Europe, Africa, India, and China in a network of commerce, religion, and power. The success in Macao also foreshadowed the empire's later struggles to maintain these outposts against rivals like the Dutch and the British, lessons we'll see unfold in places like Hormuz and Malacca. Life in Macao was vivid and unpredictable. Festivals mixed Chinese and Portuguese traditions, markets overflowed with goods, and stories of distant lands were swapped over wine and tea. It was a place where opportunity and danger existed side by side. Pirates threatened shipments, political shifts in China could disrupt trade, and internal conflicts occasionally erupted among the Portuguese themselves. Yet, despite these challenges, Macao endured, thriving as a gateway that connected Europe with the mysteries of the East. The rise of Macao reminds us that empires are not just about conquest. They are about adaptability, negotiation, and vision. Portugal's success here relied on understanding the local world while asserting its own presence, a balancing act that defined much of its global strategy. And while Macao's story might seem like a distant echo compared to Vasco da Gama's journey to India, it is part of the same narrative, a world being stitched together by courage, ambition, and the unrelenting desire to connect across oceans. Macao became more than a trading post. It became a symbol of possibility, a place where Europe first glimpsed the grandeur of China and where cultures intertwined in ways that would resonate for centuries. In those narrow streets and bustling ports, the story of Portugal's global empire unfolds, one negotiated foothold at a time. Brazil, the accidental colony that became the crown jewel. Imagine stumbling upon a land so vast, so green, so alive, that it feels like the earth itself is breathing under your feet. That's exactly what happened to the Portuguese in the year 1500, when Pedro Álvares Cabral's fleet, originally bound for India, veered off course and landed on the eastern coast of what would later be called Brazil. No one had planned for this. It wasn't the gold, it wasn't the spices, and it certainly wasn't the crown. It was a happy accident that would eventually transform Portugal into a global powerhouse. The first encounters with the indigenous peoples were tentative, cautious, and, at times, comical. Imagine sailors stepping onto shore, terrified of everything they couldn't name, while locals watched these strange, pale-skinned, bearded visitors with curiosity that matched their own. Gifts were exchanged, words fumbled, and in that mix of fear and fascination, Portugal saw opportunity. What started as a minor claim in an uncharted land quickly became a foothold for ambition. Brazil's real treasure, though, didn't lie in the land itself at first. It was in the forests, the rivers, and eventually in the soil that could yield sugar, the crop that would become the backbone of the colony's wealth. Sugar plantations transformed the coastline, bringing Portuguese settlers, African slaves, and a whole new social system that tied the colony's fortunes to Europe's insatiable appetite for sweetness. By the mid-16th century, Brazil was no longer an accidental colony. It was a jewel in the crown, outshining some of Portugal's more calculated overseas holdings. The geography alone made Brazil both a blessing and a challenge. Dense jungles, vast rivers, and unknown wildlife tested every expedition. Remember the early explorers like Bartolomeu Dias and Vasco da Gama? Their oceanic feats were dangerous, but Brazil demanded a different kind of endurance. Inland expeditions faced not just the elements, but resistance from indigenous tribes who were far from passive. These tribes, with their knowledge of the land, became both guides and obstacles, shaping Portuguese strategies in ways that few European powers could anticipate. Religion played a major role too. Missionaries followed the settlers, eager to convert the native population. It wasn't always peaceful. There were conflicts, cultural clashes, and moments that would ripple through centuries. Yet the missionaries also laid the foundations of schools, churches, and towns that connected Brazil culturally to Europe, even as the land itself remained wild, untamed, and overwhelmingly larger than Portugal could have imagined. Gold, diamonds, and other precious resources were discovered later, but by then, the colony's identity was already forming. Brazil wasn't just a distant outpost. It was the place where Portugal could exercise influence on a massive scale, the land that could feed its economy, and the canvas for projecting power across the Atlantic. Its size alone meant that, while other colonies were often vulnerable to rivals, Brazil had room to grow, expand, and adapt. Trade networks developed. Portuguese ports connected Brazil to Lisbon, and from there, goods flowed throughout Europe. Sugar, timber, gold, and later coffee became symbols of Brazil's wealth and strategic importance. But it wasn't just about commodities. Brazil became a laboratory for empire building, a place where Portugal tested governance, defense, and integration of diverse populations. It also became a link in the chain that connected the Atlantic to Africa and Europe, part of the same global story that started with Vasco da Gama's journey to India and the spice trade. Over time, Brazil's accidental discovery became the centerpiece of Portugal's ambitions. It influenced politics, culture, and identity in ways that no one had predicted when Cabral first stepped ashore. The colony grew, cities emerged, and by the 17th century, Brazil was firmly established as the crown jewel of a maritime empire, its story intertwined with trade, exploration, and the complex human drama of colonization. Even today, the echoes of that early encounter are everywhere in language, architecture, and culture. What began as a navigational mistake became a defining moment, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary chapters of history start with an accident. And as we'll see later, the colony's vast potential would eventually spark both the rise of a new nation and the eventual unraveling of Portugal's global dominance. Brazil was not just discovered, it was claimed, transformed, and over centuries, elevated to a place of central importance, forever linking its destiny to the daring spirit of the Portuguese Empire, missionaries, merchants, and the spread of Catholic faith. Picture a crowded port in Goa, the sun blazing off the ocean, ships creaking under the weight of spices, silks, and precious metals. Among the merchants and sailors, there's another kind of traveller missionaries in simple robes, clutching crosses and prayer books, moving with purpose. To outsiders, they might seem out of place amid the bustle of commerce, but in the Portuguese Empire, faith and trade were inseparable. Every voyage carried more than goods. It carried the promise of a new spiritual order. Portugal's early empire didn't just want money, it wanted influence, respect, and a moral imprint on the world. Missionaries were the vanguard of that ambition. Jesuits, Franciscans, and Dominicans set out to convert local populations in Africa, India, and the Far East. Their methods varied. Some relied on preaching and education, others on building churches that became centers of community life. They weren't just spreading religion, they were weaving Portuguese culture into foreign lands, creating footholds that were spiritual as well as political. This was a world where merchants and missionaries often worked side by side. Trade and faith reinforced each other. A merchant establishing a trading post needed safe relations with locals. A missionary could negotiate goodwill or even mediate disputes. In return, missionaries gained access to communities and resources that would have been otherwise closed. Imagine a bustling market in Malacca. Spices changing hands, languages colliding, and in the midst of it, a church bell ringing, calling people to learn the teachings of a foreign faith. The two worlds were deeply entangled. Education played a surprising role in this spread of faith. Missionaries established schools to teach reading, writing, and religion, often in local languages. These schools became centers of influence, where children learned not only prayers but also Portuguese ways of thinking, maps, and stories of distant lands. It wasn't just about converting souls, it was about creating generations that understood the empire's culture and values. Some students went on to serve as translators, advisors, or allies to Portuguese authorities, blending commerce, administration, and faith in ways that strengthened imperial control. But the missionaries faced resistance too. Local religions and traditions were deeply rooted, and conversion was rarely easy or immediate. In some regions, attempts to impose foreign beliefs led to tension or rebellion. Yet, even resistance shaped the empire, forcing the Portuguese to adapt. They learned to compromise, to blend rituals, and sometimes to accept coexistence, showing that the spread of faith was never a straightforward conquest but a complex, ongoing negotiation. Portugal's focus on religion wasn't limited to Asia. In Brazil, missionaries traveled alongside settlers, shaping indigenous communities and supporting colonial administration. They baptized children, taught European agriculture and crafts, and often acted as mediators between colonists and local populations. This blend of influence ensured that Portuguese culture, language, faith, and customs took root far from Europe. It's fascinating how the same patterns that worked in Goa or Malacca echoed thousands of miles away in South America. The empire's success in spreading Catholic faith also depended on visionaries like Prince Henry the Navigator and Vasco da Gama, whose voyages opened routes for both commerce and conversion. Remember how the spice trade created wealth and influence. That wealth funded missions, built churches, and sustained the priests who traveled halfway around the world. Faith and fortune were not just companions, they were allies in shaping Portugal's global reach. Even in places like Macao, the blend of trade and missionary activity left a lasting mark. Churches and schools became centers of cultural exchange, where European science, religion, and philosophy mingled with local traditions. The Portuguese didn't just dominate trade routes, they created networks of knowledge and belief that would endure long after their political power waned. Ultimately, missionaries, merchants, and the spread of Catholic faith were threads woven into the same tapestry. Each reinforced the other, shaping not just lands and seas, but minds and hearts. Portugal's empire thrived because it understood that control wasn't only about cannons or fortresses, it was about shaping ideas, nurturing loyalty, and leaving a legacy that would outlast ships and gold. Faith traveled with commerce, ambition with piety, and together they forged a Portuguese presence that stretched across continents, leaving marks that can still be seen in language, architecture, and culture today. It was a strategy of both conviction and pragmatism, turning devotion into influence and devotion into empire. Clashes with rivals. Ottomans, Arabs, and the Dutch threat. Imagine sailing across the Indian Ocean, your ship heavy with spices, gold and silks, only to realize you're not the only one with designs on these riches. By the 16th century, Portugal had established a sprawling network of forts and trade posts, but controlling the seas wasn't as simple as planting flags. Powerful rivals, the Ottomans, wealthy Arab traders, and later the Dutch were determined to challenge Portuguese dominance. Every journey became a high-stakes game where skill, strategy, and sometimes sheer luck decided who would prosper and who would be pushed back. The first major challenge came from the Arab traders who had dominated Indian Ocean trade for centuries. These merchants were skilled navigators, familiar with monsoon winds, and deeply connected with local rulers along the coasts of East Africa, India, and the Arabian Peninsula. When Portuguese ships arrived, they weren't just competing for goods, they were disrupting an entire centuries-old system. Arab fleets resisted, sometimes with armed confrontations, but more often through trade wars, alliances with local powers, and blockades at key ports. Portugal quickly realized that sheer firepower alone wouldn't guarantee success. Diplomacy, espionage, and strategic fort placement were just as critical. Then came the Ottomans, expanding their empire into the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. They saw Portuguese control of strategic ports like Hormuz as a direct threat to their influence and to the pilgrimage routes that were vital to their legitimacy. Ottoman fleets challenged Portuguese dominance at sea, leading to a series of intense naval engagements. One miscalculation could leave a fleet stranded or a fortress isolated, and the Portuguese learned that controlling distant territories required constant vigilance and well-supplied garrisons. These clashes weren't just about goods. They were battles for prestige, influence, and control of the maritime routes that connected continents. By the late 16th century, a new competitor appeared, the Dutch. Motivated by the same desire for wealth and influence, the Dutch East India Company brought aggressive tactics, advanced ships, and an unrelenting hunger to dominate the spice trade. Unlike previous rivals, the Dutch had the resources and organization to challenge Portugal on multiple fronts simultaneously. They seized strategic points in the Indian Ocean, captured key fortresses, and disrupted Portuguese trade networks. The empire that had once seemed invincible began to feel the pressure, forcing Portuguese commanders to stretch resources thin across thousands of miles of ocean. These rivalries also created a complex web of local alliances. Portuguese officers often had to negotiate with local rulers to maintain influence, sometimes siding with one faction against another. In Malacca, for instance, the Portuguese faced combined resistance from local sultans and their Ottoman allies. In Africa, Arab traders leveraged their connections with inland kingdoms to challenge Portuguese forts. Success wasn't guaranteed, and every victory required a delicate balance of military action, diplomacy, and strategic foresight. Despite these challenges, Portugal managed to hold on to key strongholds for decades. Their fortresses, naval innovations, and experience in long-distance trade gave them an edge, at least temporarily. But each clash drained resources, required constant reinforcement, and tested the limits of the small kingdom. The empire that once seemed limitless now had to contend with persistent threats that could appear anywhere along the trade routes, from the Red Sea to Southeast Asia. Interestingly, these rivalries also spurred innovation. Portuguese ship design improved, navigation techniques became more sophisticated, and military tactics adapted to counter the strengths of each competitor. Every confrontation, whether a skirmish with Arab traders, A naval battle with the Ottomans or a siege by Dutch forces forced Portugal to evolve. In a way, these threats shaped the empire as much as its visionaries did. Remember Prince Henry the Navigator? His early efforts to push into unknown waters laid the foundation for Portugal's ability to withstand these rival pressures centuries later. Still, the costs were high. Constant battles drained treasure and manpower, and some fortresses fell to persistent attacks. The empire that had once stretched effortlessly across 3 oceans began to feel the strain. By the 17th century, it was clear that Portuguese dominance was no longer unchallenged. The Dutch, in particular, would gradually chip away at the empire's most lucrative territories, signaling the slow erosion of Portugal's maritime supremacy. But in the heat of these struggles, Portugal demonstrated resilience. Against Ottomans, Arabs, and Dutch alike, it proved that even a relatively small kingdom could project power across continents through strategy, fortifications, and relentless ambition. The clashes shaped not only the empire's fortunes but also the very nature of global trade, maritime warfare, and cross-cultural encounters. Portugal's story during these centuries wasn't just about exploration and expansion, it was about survival against forces that were just as determined, just as clever, and just as hungry for the riches of the seas. By the end, these rivalries left a lasting imprint, teaching the world that control of the oceans required more than ships and courage. It required vision, adaptability, and the willingness to face threats head-on, no matter how powerful. The height of power, a global empire in 3 oceans. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. A tiny European kingdom with a coastline no longer than a handful of cities, suddenly commanding trade routes from the shores of Africa to the ports of India, from Brazil's lush forests to the harbors of China. Ships with red crosses on their sails crisscrossing 3 oceans, fortresses rising like chess pieces along strategic coasts, merchants counting riches unimaginable. That was Portugal at the peak of its power, a global empire that seemed to defy the limits of size and imagination. The transformation wasn't overnight. It began with the fearless early voyages we talked about before, sailors venturing beyond fear, proving that the world was navigable. From those beginnings, Portugal expanded rapidly, and each success built on the last. Bartolomeu Dias had rounded the Cape of Storms, Vasco da Gama had reached India, and the crown had begun to see its small nation not just as part of Europe, but as a ruler of seas and trade routes. Ambition became momentum, and momentum became empire. By the mid-16th century, Portuguese influence stretched across the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the South China Sea. Fortresses were more than defensive, they were symbols of dominance, supply hubs, and trade centers. Goa in India, Malacca in Southeast Asia, Macao in China, and settlements along Africa's east coast weren't isolated outposts, they were nodes in a network connecting continents. Ships left Lisbon carrying silver and soldiers, returned with spices, silk, and exotic goods. Every voyage reinforced the sense that Portugal could touch every corner of the globe, sometimes before anyone else even knew the place existed. The empire wasn't just about commerce. It was about power projection. The Portuguese navy, though small compared to the giants of later centuries, was incredibly efficient. Caravels and carracks, fast and durable, patrolled seas, escorted merchants, and sometimes engaged in battles that could change the balance of trade. They had learned from early mistakes, from near disasters at sea, and turned those lessons into strategies that allowed them to dominate trade routes for decades. Each success made rivals nervous, from the Ottomans and Arabs in the Indian Ocean to the Dutch and English who would eventually rise as competitors. But what made this era remarkable wasn't just the sheer reach, it was how Portugal connected seemingly distant worlds. Brazil's forests supplied sugar that fed Europe, while Indian pepper and Chinese silks flowed through Goa and Macao. Silver from the Americas funded fleets in the East. Trade, faith, and culture intertwined, forming a network that made Portugal a living, breathing global presence. Missionaries followed the merchants, spreading beliefs, education, and sometimes causing friction with local populations, but also creating enduring cultural ties. It was the human side of empire people, ideas and traditions moving across oceans faster than ever before. Of course, managing such an empire was not easy. Communication was slow, local populations had their own agendas, and rivals lurked at every corner. But Portugal's administrators, merchants, and captains adapted, creating a system that allowed them to extract resources efficiently while maintaining loyalty or at least compliance among distant colonies. It was a delicate balance of diplomacy, strategy, and sometimes brute force. Fortresses weren't just military, they were administrative centers, hubs of control, and symbols of authority. At its height, the empire was more than just a collection of territories, it was a statement of ambition realized. From the storms off the Cape of Good Hope to the busy ports of Macao, from the sugar plantations of Brazil to the spice markets of Malacca, Portugal's reach seemed limitless. People on distant shores recognized the Red Cross of Portugal not just as a flag, but as a signal that a single European kingdom had changed the game entirely. This period of dominance, however, was as fragile as it was impressive. Rival powers, internal challenges, and the limits of such a sprawling network meant that the empire's peak was a moment in time, brilliant and shining but temporary. Still, the vision of a global empire in 3 oceans was realized in ways few could have imagined when the first explorers sailed past the unknown, fearing monsters and the abyss. And in that moment, Portugal wasn't just a country, it was a force that connected continents, a kingdom that made the world smaller, and a power that inspired ambition for generations to come. Every fortress, every ship, every trade route was a testament to what could be achieved when courage, strategy, and imagination sailed together across the oceans. The union with Spain and the decline of autonomy. Imagine a proud little kingdom, its ships stretching across oceans, its traders and missionaries reaching India, Africa, and even China, suddenly finding itself under the same crown as a much larger neighbour. That's Portugal in the year 1580, when the death of King Henry without an heir plunged the nation into a crisis. For centuries, Portugal had carved a global empire with its own vision, from Bartolomeu Dias rounding the Cape of Storms to Vasco da Gama reaching India, yet now its independence teetered on the edge. Spain, ever the giant on the Iberian Peninsula, moved quickly. Philip II claimed the Portuguese throne, not with immediate war but through political maneuvering and family ties. What seemed like a peaceful transition soon revealed its consequences. Portugal kept its own laws and customs in theory, but in practice, decisions about its fleets, colonies, and trade routes increasingly came under Spanish influence. The autonomy that had allowed Portugal to explore uncharted waters and dominate the spice trade began to erode. For the Portuguese overseas, the effects were immediate and unsettling. Fortresses from Goa to Malacca suddenly operated under directives that prioritized Spanish interests, sometimes at odds with local realities. Remember the daring voyages of Bartolomeu Dias and Vasco da Gama? Those were driven by Portuguese ambition. Yet now, the empire's priorities were tangled with Spain's vast territories. Portuguese traders in Asia found themselves competing not just with local powers, but also navigating the new dynamics imposed by Madrid. The balance of power shifted subtly but dangerously. Pirates, rivals, and neighboring empires watched eagerly. The Dutch and the English, sensing weakness, began probing Portuguese holdings, attacking shipping lanes, and forming alliances with local rulers. The once dominant Portuguese fleets now had to stretch thinner across 3 oceans, defending an empire whose strategic vision was compromised by the Union. Every fortification built in the east, every trading post in Africa, suddenly required justification not to Lisbon, but to a king who was more concerned with the affairs of Spain. The decline of autonomy made the empire vulnerable in ways that ambition and courage alone could no longer protect. At home, the Union stirred resentment. Portuguese nobles and merchants bristled at losing influence, and common citizens felt the weight of foreign priorities on their daily lives. Taxes increased to fund broader imperial campaigns, and Portuguese identity began to feel diluted. The vibrant culture of Macao, the bustling markets of Goa, even the accidental crown jewel of Brazil, all these outposts were now pieces in a game orchestrated from afar. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable now had cracks showing through. Yet the story wasn't entirely bleak. Portuguese administrators and local leaders still found ways to maneuver, maintain trade, and protect their interests. Macao continued to thrive as a gateway to China, and Brazil slowly grew in importance. But the golden era of rapid expansion, where explorers like Dias and da Gama could act with daring autonomy, was over. Portugal's global strategy became reactive rather than visionary, defending what it had rather than boldly seeking what it could gain. The Union also highlights the fragility of empires. Even a nation that once controlled the oceans can see its power diminished when its independence is compromised. Portuguese navigators had proven that courage and knowledge could open new worlds. But political entanglements showed that maintaining those worlds required more than skill at sea. It required sovereign authority, clear vision, and unity of purpose. With Spain pulling strings, Portugal's empire slowly shifted from a story of exploration to a struggle of survival. This period set the stage for later challenges: Dutch attacks in Asia, British ambitions in Africa, and eventually the struggles that would culminate in the loss of Brazil. It's a reminder that empires are as fragile as their leadership, and even great navigators cannot sail against the tides of politics. The union with Spain didn't erase Portugal's achievements. The Cape of Storms, Macao, and the routes to India still existed, but it dulled the shine, placing the empire on a path toward decline. By the time Portugal regained full independence in 1668, much had changed. The empire had endured, but the lessons of the Union lingered. Autonomy is the backbone of ambition, and once lost, it is nearly impossible to reclaim the unrestrained vision that built a global empire. The stories of explorers and colonies remained. But the power that had once allowed Portugal to reach across the seas had been tempered. A warning etched into the history of the empire: battles lost, from Hormuz to Malacca. Picture this: the Portuguese, who had once seemed unstoppable on the seas, suddenly facing enemies they couldn't simply outgun or outmaneuver. The empire that had begun with daring explorers like Vasco da Gama and bold fortresses stretching across oceans now found itself on the defensive. From the shimmering waters of Hormuz to the bustling ports of Malacca, Portugal's losses were as dramatic as its victories, reshaping the empire in ways that few had anticipated. Hormuz was one of the first glaring warnings. This strategic island controlled access to the Persian Gulf, and the Portuguese had captured it in the early 1600s with relative ease, building a fortress that allowed them to dominate trade routes. But their hold was never absolute. Local powers, backed by Persian forces and rival traders, constantly challenged them. Supply lines were stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean, and maintaining control required more men and ships than Lisbon could always spare. Every small rebellion, every well-timed assault by local forces chipped away at their dominance. The Portuguese realized that fortresses alone couldn't guarantee power if you were constantly surrounded by adversaries who knew the waters, the winds, and the politics better than you did. Malacca tells a similar story, but with higher stakes. This city, perched on the vital straits connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, was a jewel for any empire. Controlling it meant controlling the spice trade. The Portuguese seized it in 150120, and for a time it seemed like nothing could challenge their grip. But the city was a magnet for enemies. The Sultan of Johor, regional Malay powers, and later the Dutch, all coveted Malacca. Guerrilla attacks, naval skirmishes, and sieges became a constant threat. Each lost ship or defeated squadron wasn't just a tactical setback, it was a blow to morale and to the empire's image of invincibility. What made these defeats so impactful was how interconnected they were with the broader story of the Portuguese Empire. Remember Vasco da Gama's journey to India and the initial dominance in spice routes? Those triumphs created targets. Success invited rivals, and the more Portugal expanded, the more vulnerable its holdings became. The empire had grown faster than its capacity to defend every corner, and the losses at Hormuz and Malacca highlighted that vulnerability in stark, unavoidable terms. Beyond just military defeat, these losses revealed the limits of Portuguese power. Local knowledge mattered more than European cannons in many cases. A well-placed fleet could blockade a harbour, but knowing the currents, the monsoon winds, and the hidden inlets was priceless. The Portuguese had skill and courage, but their opponents had familiarity, alliances, and determination. Over time, even the fortresses and naval patrols that had seemed invincible could be undermined, besieged, or circumvented. There's also the human element. Soldiers and sailors, far from home for years at a stretch, struggled with disease, supply shortages, and fatigue. Each loss at Hormuz or Malacca wasn't just a strategic defeat. It eroded the confidence of men who had once believed Portugal could conquer the seas entirely. When news of a lost fortress reached Lisbon, it forced the crown to rethink strategy, redirect funds, and sometimes abandon ambitions that had seemed non-negotiable. Yet, these battles weren't just about loss. They were lessons that shaped the empire's next moves. Portuguese leaders began to understand that global dominance required more than bold expeditions. It demanded diplomacy, alliances, and sometimes pragmatism over sheer force. The decline at Hormuz and Malacca foreshadowed the challenges they would later face against the Dutch and British, who combined trade acumen with military precision to chip away at Portuguese power across Asia. And while these defeats marked the beginning of a slow unraveling, they also underscored the extraordinary reach the empire had achieved at its height. Few European powers had ever held outposts from the Persian Gulf to the Straits of Malacca, even if only briefly. These losses remind us that empire is never static. Every conquest carries the seeds of vulnerability, and every setback can teach harsh, unforgettable lessons. By the time Portugal began to struggle at Malacca, the stage was set for a larger story of decline, competition, and eventual loss, a tale that would continue with the Dutch and British encroaching on the very waters that Vasco da Gama once sailed so boldly. From Hormuz to Malacca, the battles lost were as defining as the victories, proving that even an empire built on audacity and daring could be humbled by strategy, distance, and the relentless tides of history. The slow collapse. Dutch and British take over the seas. By the late 1600s, the Portuguese Empire, once feared and admired across the oceans, was starting to show cracks. Imagine standing on a bustling Portuguese dock in Goa or Malacca, watching ships sail in with the same spices and silks that had once made the empire untouchable. But now, those treasures were fewer, delayed, and increasingly intercepted by new rivals. The Dutch and the British weren't just arriving, they were coming to stay, and Portugal's dominance was quietly slipping through its fingers. It didn't happen overnight. For decades, Portugal had held the oceans with skill, strategy, and a network of fortresses from Africa to India. The empire thrived on monopolies: pepper from Malabar, cloves from the Moluccas, and gold from Brazil. But as Europe changed, the balance of power shifted. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1698, had a new model: well-funded, organized, and ruthlessly efficient. They weren't explorers in the old sense, they were merchants armed with fleets, banks, and military precision. The Portuguese were still clinging to the old ways: smaller fleets, slower communication, and a reliance on local allies who were now tempted by Dutch gold. The British, through the East India Company, were equally relentless. They didn't need to conquer everything they could out-trade, out-negotiate, and slowly encircle Portuguese holdings. Ports like Cochin and Ceylon, which had once been unassailable, were vulnerable to blockades and bribes. Every lost fortress or trading post wasn't just a loss of goods, it was a blow to prestige and morale. Sailors and merchants started whispering about the new masters of the sea, a stark contrast to the golden age of Portuguese dominance when their ships inspired awe across continents. Brazil, once the crown jewel, offered some solace, but couldn't offset losses in Asia and Africa. The colony thrived economically, yet the empire's heartbeat was global trade. And that heartbeat was slowing. Dutch fleets invaded northeast Brazil in 1630, carving out lucrative sugar plantations. Portuguese authorities managed to fight back eventually, but the effort drained resources and revealed vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, in India and the East Indies, forts fell one by one to better armed European competitors. Portugal's maritime empire, so carefully stitched together with forts, treaties, and alliances, was unraveling. Internal factors worsened the problem. The Iberian Union, a period when Portugal was under Spanish rule from 1580 to 1640, had already weakened autonomy and distracted the crown with European conflicts. By the time Portugal regained independence, other European powers had mastered the art of global trade and naval warfare. Portuguese ships, once the fastest and most daring on the oceans, were now outmatched. Where they had relied on courage and cunning, the Dutch and British relied on industrial-style efficiency, discipline, and scale. It was a lesson that bravery alone couldn't sustain an empire in the age of competition. Disease, corruption, and administrative fatigue compounded the collapse. Fortresses became expensive burdens. Local alliances frayed as rival Europeans offered better terms to native rulers. Every loss, no matter how small, had a ripple effect. Portuguese sailors who once struck fear in coastal communities found themselves negotiating rather than conquering, scrambling to maintain relevance in a rapidly changing world. The empire's image as a global power was eroding. Yet the decline wasn't total. Portugal still held key strongholds. Goa in India, Macao in China, and Mozambique in Africa. These outposts allowed them to survive as a minor player, maintaining pockets of influence while the Dutch and British expanded their networks. But the golden era of dominance, the days of Vasco da Gama, Bartolomeu Dias, and Prince Henry, was over. What had once been an unstoppable wave of ambition was now a trickle, overshadowed by emerging global powers. This slow collapse teaches a lesson about empires, ambition, and timing. Portugal's early success relied on audacity, navigation, and innovation. Its decline came from rivals who improved upon those same techniques, paired with wealth and organization on a scale Portugal could no longer match. The seas that had once belonged almost exclusively to Portugal became arenas of fierce competition, with Dutch and British flags replacing crosses on the waves. By the 18th century, the empire had survived, but only just. It retained its culture, language, and scattered outposts, but its reach was diminished. The slow, steady erosion of Portuguese dominance was a quiet drama compared to the grand conquests of its past. Ships still sailed, spices still moved, and missionaries still preached, but the days when Portugal dictated terms across 3 oceans were fading. The empire had entered a long shadow, a period of endurance rather than expansion, where survival became the measure of success, and the glory of old legends was now a story to be remembered rather than repeated. The Brazilian independence and the shattering of an empire. Imagine a sprawling land across the Atlantic, lush with forests, rivers, and gold-rich mountains, yet tied to a distant kingdom thousands of miles away. That land was Brazil, once the crown jewel of Portugal, producing wealth, resources, and prestige that fueled the empire. But by the early 19th century, the relationship between colony and crown had frayed. The distant king, João VI, had returned to Portugal after the Napoleonic Wars, leaving his son Pedro in Brazil. And what followed would change the course of both nations forever. Brazil had grown far beyond what Portugal could comfortably control. Its population was diverse, a mix of indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and European settlers, with economies ranging from sugar plantations in the northeast to coffee and gold in the south and interior. Local elites were powerful, wealthy, and increasingly aware that their destiny might be better served without constant oversight from Lisbon. The seeds of independence had been quietly sprouting for decades, nurtured by ideas of self-governance, economic freedom, and the winds of change sweeping across the Americas. King João VI's departure in 1820 brought both opportunity and tension. His son Pedro remained as regent, a symbolic presence meant to maintain loyalty to the crown. But Pedro was different from the distant administrators in Lisbon. He had lived in Brazil, understood its complexities, and formed connections with its elites. Slowly, whispers turned into conversations, and conversations into plans. When Portugal demanded that Brazil return to a colonial status and subordinate itself to Lisbon, resistance hardened. What Lisbon saw as loyalty, Brazil increasingly saw as subjugation. The moment of rupture came on September 7th, 1822, when Pedro, urged by Brazilian leaders and influenced by growing nationalist sentiment, declared independence along the banks of the Ipiranga River. It was a dramatic, symbolic act, a single shout that marked the beginning of Brazil as a nation. "Independence or death," he proclaimed, a declaration that reverberated across the land, shaking the foundations of the Portuguese Empire. For centuries, Portugal had projected power across oceans, relying on forts, trade, and diplomacy to maintain control. Now, its largest and most profitable colony had slipped from its grasp in a single, decisive moment. The aftermath was turbulent. Battles followed in some regions as loyalist forces resisted, but overall, the transition was remarkably swift compared to other independence movements. Brazil retained the monarchy, with Pedro crowned as Emperor Pedro I, a strategic choice that helped stabilize the nation while keeping ties to Portuguese traditions. Economically, however, Portugal suffered. The loss of Brazil meant the empire no longer commanded the vast wealth of sugar, gold, and coffee exports that had fueled its ambitions for centuries. The once glorious maritime empire, which had dominated trade routes and fortresses across 3 oceans, was now severely diminished. The independence of Brazil also sent shockwaves through Portugal itself. Politically, the kingdom faced instability, debates over reform, and the recognition that its global influence had been severely curtailed. For the empire, the loss marked more than just territory. It signified a turning point where the idea of a global Portuguese dominion began to fade. Future colonies like Angola, Mozambique, and Goa would remain, but the golden jewel, the heart of the empire, was gone. Portugal would never again project the same level of power or prestige across the oceans. Yet even in this moment of loss, there was transformation. Brazil's independence demonstrated the power of local identity, strategic leadership, and the momentum of change. It showed that empires, no matter how vast, could be undone when distant rulers failed to adapt to local realities. Portugal's global story did not end with Brazil's independence, but the empire had been irreversibly altered. The focus shifted to Africa and Asia, where fortresses and trade posts continued, but the scale and economic significance could never match what had been lost. In hindsight, Brazilian independence was both an ending and a beginning. It ended the golden era of Portugal's empire, shattering illusions of permanence and invincibility. But it also marked the birth of a new nation, a country that would carry Portuguese language, culture, and influence far beyond Europe, in a way Portugal itself could no longer claim. The empire that had once stretched across oceans now had to reconcile with a smaller, redefined reality. Brazil had grown powerful enough to claim its destiny, and Portugal, despite centuries of maritime mastery and fortresses controlling seas, was left to watch as its crown jewel became a nation of its own making. It was a lesson in ambition, distance, and the fragility of even the mightiest empires when the world around them changes. The last strongholds, Mozambique, Angola, and Goa's fall. By the early 20th century, the Portuguese Empire had shrunk to a few stubborn outposts, remnants of a time when their ships had ruled 3 oceans. The golden age of discovery was long gone, and yet in places like Mozambique, Angola, and Goa, Portugal clung to power with a fierce stubbornness that seemed almost heroic. These last strongholds weren't just colonies, they were symbols of a legacy that had survived centuries of rival empires, wars, and revolutions. Mozambique, stretched along the southeastern coast of Africa, had once been a vital link in Portugal's Indian Ocean trade. Its ports connected Lisbon to India and beyond, bringing in spices, ivory, and slaves. By the late 19th century, Mozambique had become more than just a trade hub. It was a battleground of influence, with the British and Germans eyeing its coast. Portugal fortified its cities, built railways to connect the interior, and tried desperately to modernize administration. But it was a fragile control. Local resistance simmered constantly, and distant Lisbon often struggled to maintain authority over lands so far away. Yet, Mozambique held a testament to Portugal's determination to remain relevant, even as the empire had long since lost its former glory. Angola told a similar story. Its rich soils and mineral wealth had always drawn Portuguese interest, and by the 20th century it had become the jewel of their African holdings. Luanda and Benguela were hubs of colonial administration, but the Portuguese faced unrelenting challenges: indigenous uprisings, pressure from rival colonial powers, and the logistical nightmare of governing such a vast territory made Angola a test of endurance. The settlers, soldiers, and administrators stationed there were caught in a delicate balancing act, trying to exploit resources while keeping resistance in check. Angola's survival as a colony was not guaranteed. It was fought for every day, through strategy, stubbornness, and sheer will. Then there was Goa, the crown jewel of the East, which had once dazzled as the gateway to India. For centuries, it had been a thriving centre of trade, religion, and culture, a testament to Portuguese ambition and influence. But by the mid-20th century, Goa's position had become untenable. The rise of India as an independent nation after 1947 meant that Goa, isolated and surrounded, could no longer be maintained by a distant European power. Despite fortresses and decades of administration, Portuguese control over Goa was increasingly symbolic, a shadow of its former might. And in 1961, Indian forces moved decisively, integrating Goa into the new nation and ending over 4 centuries of Portuguese rule. These last strongholds, in their final decades, were marked by a mix of nostalgia, resistance, and adaptation. In Mozambique and Angola, Portugal attempted to modernize infrastructure, schools, and governance, projecting an image of benevolent colonial power. Yet, these efforts often masked the harsh realities. Local populations resisting forced labor, limited political freedoms, and economic exploitation. In Goa, centuries of cultural fusion remained, with churches, temples, and markets reflecting a complex history, but the political control that had once seemed unshakable was slipping fast. What connects these 3 territories is the story of persistence against overwhelming odds. Portugal, a nation that had once shaped global trade and exploration, now fought to keep a foothold in a world that had moved on. Every fortress, railway, and administrative decree was a battle against time, geography, and rising nationalist movements. The empire that had spanned continents was now reduced to pockets of influence, each holding memories of ambition, courage, and daring that had defined centuries of Portuguese history. And yet, in their fall, these strongholds reveal something remarkable about Portugal's legacy. Even as Mozambique and Angola eventually gained independence in 1975, and Goa became fully integrated into India, the imprint of centuries of Portuguese culture, language, architecture, and trade networks remained. Streets, buildings, and cultural practices in these regions still whisper of an era when Portugal's reach stretched far beyond Europe, connecting continents through ambition, exploration, and the human desire to leave a mark on the world. In the end, Mozambique, Angola, and Goa weren't just the last colonies, they were the closing chapters of a story that began with explorers sailing into the unknown, forts rising along distant coasts, and a tiny kingdom daring to become a global power. Their fall marked the end of an era, but the legacy of courage, strategy, and vision that built them continued to ripple across continents, reminding us that even the smallest nations can leave an enormous footprint on the world. The Carnation Revolution and Portugal's final retreat. April 1974 arrived like a whisper at first, then a roar. Portugal, long weighed down by decades of dictatorship, colonial wars, and economic strain, finally reached a breaking point. Soldiers in Lisbon quietly organized a movement, their weapons hidden beneath coats, their eyes determined. And yet, instead of gunfire and chaos dominating the streets, something extraordinary happened. Carnations appeared in the barrels of rifles, handed to the soldiers by civilians. Peaceful rebellion. A revolution wrapped in flowers, a nation daring to reclaim its future. For centuries, Portugal had clung to its empire with stubborn pride. From the bustling ports of Goa and Macao to the vast jungles of Angola and Mozambique, these colonies were seen as symbols of national prestige, a reminder of the glory days of Bartolomeu, Vasco da Gama, and the explorers who had first stretched Portugal across the oceans. But by the 20th century, the cost of maintaining these territories had become unbearable. Wars in Africa drained resources, morale faltered, and international pressure grew. The empire that had once spanned continents was now a liability. The revolution was swift and almost surreal. Citizens poured into the streets, soldiers refused to fight, and the authoritarian regime crumbled in days. Portugal had chosen democracy, but the question remained, what about the empire? The answer came gradually, painfully, and inevitably. One by one, colonies moved toward independence. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau territories that had been under Portuguese control for centuries began the process of self-determination. The empire that had once connected Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America was unraveling before everyone's eyes. This retreat was not just political, it was deeply emotional. For generations, Portuguese identity had been intertwined with its colonies. Families had lived across continents. Wealth and culture had flowed back and forth. And the nation's sense of itself had been built on the idea of global reach. Letting go meant confronting decades of history, triumphs and mistakes alike. Cities like Goa and Macao, jewels of the empire, became distant memories, symbols of both pride and loss. The same ports where missionaries, merchants, and sailors had once danced between worlds now marked the end of an era. And yet, the Carnation Revolution offered hope. Portugal was no longer shackled by a declining empire or endless colonial wars. It could rebuild, redefine itself, and turn inward to focus on democracy, education, and prosperity. The revolution showed that retreat does not always mean defeat. Sometimes it is a necessary step towards survival and renewal. For decades, the empire had extended Portuguese culture, language, and influence across the globe. Even as colonies gained independence, those legacies endured, reminding the world of Portugal's historic reach. The retreat also forced Portugal to confront its past honestly. From the audacious voyages of Bartolomeu Dias and Vasco da Gama to the complex interactions in Macao, India, and Brazil, the empire had been a mix of courage, ambition, exploitation, and adaptation. By the 1970s, these lessons were no longer abstract history. They were immediate, shaping the nation's identity and policies. Citizens had to reckon with what it meant to be Portuguese in a world where the oceans were no longer theirs to command. The process was not without turmoil. Independence movements in African colonies were sometimes violent, political negotiations were tense, and the economic consequences were profound. Yet, in Lisbon and across the country, the focus shifted from holding territory to building society. The symbolism of carnations, simple, resilient, and beautiful, reflected the nation's new path. Peaceful change, collective courage, and the willingness to embrace an uncertain future. By the end of the decade, Portugal had completed its final retreat. Mozambique, Angola, and the remaining overseas territories were no longer under Lisbon's rule. The empire, once celebrated for its explorers, fortresses, and global reach, existed only in memory, culture, and language. But the story did not end in loss. The Carnation Revolution became a defining moment of renewal, showing that nations, like people, must sometimes let go of the past to step into a freer, brighter future. The legacy of the Portuguese Empire lives on, scattered across continents, in cities, in languages, in trade routes, and in the shared history of countless peoples. The Carnation Revolution marked the final chapter. The moment when Portugal turned from global dominance to introspection, embracing democracy and peace over conquest. And in that quiet yet powerful transformation, the spirit of the nation endured, stronger for having let go, ready to write a new story beyond the seas. Legacy of an empire, culture, language, and lasting influence. Close your eyes and picture the world as it was after centuries of Portuguese exploration, conquest, and trade. Ships had sailed to the farthest corners of the globe. Fortresses dotted the coasts of Africa, Asia, and South America. And yet, even as the empire faded, its fingerprints remained everywhere. You can see it in the rhythm of a Brazilian samba, hear it in the rolling Portuguese language spoken in Angola or Mozambique, and taste it in spices, recipes, and traditions that travelled halfway across the world. The legacy of the Portuguese Empire isn't just history. It's alive, threaded into culture, language, and the very way people connect across continents. Take Brazil, for instance. What began as an accidental colony, claimed by Pedro Álvares Cabral, eventually grew into the crown jewel of the empire. Portuguese settlers, African slaves, and indigenous communities blended their worlds in ways that created entirely new identities. Cities like Salvador and Rio de Janeiro still carry the architecture, street layouts, and religious festivals that echo Portugal's influence. Yet, it wasn't imitation, it was transformation. The Portuguese language merged with local dialects, African rhythms, and indigenous words, giving birth to something uniquely Brazilian. And this pattern repeated across other colonies, from Goa in India to Macao in China, each place absorbing Portuguese culture while also reshaping it. Religion was another thread woven tightly into this legacy. Missionaries, merchants, and explorers had carried their faith alongside trade and conquest. Churches rose in distant lands, blending European design with local artistry. Some of these churches are still standing, centuries later, bearing witness to a time when faith was both a bridge and a tool of empire. And while the spread of religion often came with conflict, resistance, and coercion, it also left cultural marks, festivals, traditions, and practices that endure long after the political empire itself vanished. Language is perhaps the most tangible trace. Portuguese became the heartbeat of communication across continents. In Africa, it serves as the official language in Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde. In Asia, it lingers in Goa and Macao, influencing local languages and place names. Even in Brazil, the language evolved, absorbing new words and cadences, yet remaining unmistakably Portuguese at its core. This linguistic thread connected far-flung territories, creating a subtle sense of unity that outlasted empires, wars, and independence movements. Trade and cuisine also reveal lasting influence. Remember the spice routes Vasco da Gama opened and the sugar plantations in Brazil? They weren't just economic ventures, they were cultural exchanges. Ingredients, recipes, and culinary techniques traveled with merchants and settlers, embedding themselves in local diets. From peri-peri chicken in Mozambique to feijoada in Brazil, the Portuguese Empire's culinary footprint is vast, sometimes subtle, sometimes strikingly bold, but always enduring. Art, architecture, and music further illustrate the empire's imprint. Manueline architecture in Portugal inspired adaptations in Goa, while Portuguese-style tiles and churches still decorate South American cities. Music traveled too, blending European instruments with African rhythms and indigenous melodies to create genres that are now inseparable from local identity. Cultural exchange wasn't always equal or voluntary, but it produced a tapestry that spans oceans and centuries, visible in festivals, dance, and community traditions worldwide. And even as political control waned through battles lost in Malacca, the slow decline in Asia, and Brazil's eventual independence, the Portuguese influence remained embedded in daily life. Governance structures and social norms. The empire's reach didn't end with flags lowered. It persisted in habits, languages, and collective memory. Today, scholars, travelers, and descendants trace these patterns, discovering connections between continents that seem astonishing but are a direct result of centuries of Portuguese enterprise. The legacy of the empire isn't just nostalgia, it's a living network of culture, language, and identity. From colonial fortresses turned museums to local dialects carrying centuries-old words, from cuisine to music and festivals, the story of Portugal's global reach continues to resonate. In understanding this legacy, we see how audacity, exploration, and ambition left marks far beyond conquest, shaping societies in ways that continue to echo through time. Even when the empire retreated during the Carnation Revolution and abandoned its last strongholds, the human, cultural, and linguistic connections it created didn't vanish. They adapted, survived, and thrived, proving that the real power of an empire isn't just measured in territories or trade, but in the enduring influence it imprints on the world. Portugal's empire may have ended, but its legacy lives on in the way people speak, celebrate, and connect across oceans and generations.